Hello, and welcome to today's European SharePoint, Office 365 and Azure Community webinar, the 8th and final webinar of this year's SharePoint week. My name is Laura, and I'm delighted to be joined by Anoop Tati, who will present the topic Using OpenAI API in SharePoint Framework Projects. Remember to join in on the conversation about today's webinar and more on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is #ESPC23. Don't forget to check out the Resource Centre. This is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars and how-to videos. Simply visit sharepointeurope.com and click the Content tab at the top. Continue your learning by joining us for our next webinar, the Magnificent 7 Microsoft Security and Compliance Features that you must know, which takes place Thursday, the 29th of May, from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. CEST. For full details, please check out sharepointeurope.com/register-for-webinars-. The ESPC23 program is now available. The ESPC program has the most relevant topics being presented by experienced and exciting speakers in the Microsoft 365 and Azure space. Across 4 days, there will be over 100 world-class speakers, 120 sessions, great networking, connections, parties, great food, a beautiful and accessible city, and more. Prepare to hear the very latest on topics such as Microsoft Teams, Microsoft Viva, Copilot, Search, AI, DevOps, SPFX, and of course, not forgetting the all-important Azure and security sessions. Further sessions will be added to the program throughout the year to ensure that we have the latest and most relevant sessions post-Ignite 2023. We hope you can find something on this program that could have a positive impact, whether that be on your learning, your connections, your career, or your customers. So be sure to get your tickets now and lock in the best deal possible. Please do visit sharepointeurope.com/conference/schedule/2023 to view the full program. The early bird sale for this year's European Power Platform Conference ends today. It ends tomorrow. We are now sold out of 3-day tickets for the European Power Platform Conference 2023, but you can still get your hands on some 2-day tickets while they're still available. The European Power Platform Conference dives into Microsoft's Power Platform stack and provides a host of professional development opportunities, which includes 3 inspirational keynotes, 6 expert full-day tutorials, and over 85 specialist sessions, all delivered by global Power Platform experts and Microsoft corporate and community leaders. You can gain expert insight and hear the latest innovations across Power Apps, Power BI, Power Automate, Power Virtual Agents, and Power Pages. So please do visit sharepointeurope.com/European Power Platform Conference pricing to grab your tickets while they're still at this amazing price. Okay, so after the webinar, we will have a questions and answer session. Type any question that you have into the questions window. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will also be recorded and added to the Resource Centre, where you will be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass you over to today's webinar presenter, Anoop. Hello, Anoop.
Hello, Laura. Hello, everyone. Right. Let me start by sharing my screen. And Laura, could you just confirm if you're seeing this presentation?
Yeah, it all looks good.
Right. Okay, great stuff. Thank you very much, Laura, for the introduction. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session in the SharePoint week. And this session is titled Using OpenAI in SPFX Projects. Now, this presentation or this session will be a mix of a demo, some slides, and a code walkthrough. I'm planning to take around 45 minutes of your time on this session and then answer any questions towards the end. Right. So just a bit about myself. Let's start with the boring slide. My name is Anup Tatti. I'm a Microsoft MVP in the Microsoft 365 development category. I work as a developer in a company called Content and Cloud here in the UK. There's a link to my profile, aka.ms/anupt, which has links to all my other social feeds like Twitter and LinkedIn, and you can follow me on those platforms if needed. Right. So the agenda for today's session is we'll start with the introduction. So we'll just look at what OpenAI is and how it is being used briefly. And then we'll have a look at a quick demo on how OpenAI API can be used in SPFX projects. Once that demo is done, we'll have a look at the overview of the OpenAI API, and we'll see how to set up that API so that we can integrate that API in SPFX. We'll have a look at a couple of use cases of using OpenAI in SPFX. And we'll go through the code itself to understand how OpenAI can be called from SharePoint framework projects. And finally, we'll conclude with a summary. Okay. Right. So artificial intelligence. Now, you might have seen artificial AI or artificial intelligence everywhere. So whenever you go into your LinkedIn feed or Twitter feed, you might see some posts or majority of the posts related to AI. So AI has been in the news or has been in discussions in the last few months, and it has been very popular. The reason it is popular is it is being helpful to users in many ways. Just to give you a couple of examples, take the Copilot. So all the Copilots that are being introduced by Microsoft is a very good example of how AI has been helpful to us. And we have to remember that, and it has been stressed by everyone that these Copilots are Copilots and not autopilots. So, AI helps you. AI helps you rather than taking over everything. So that's why the name Copilot. And another example of AI is the ChatGPT, which I'm sure many of you have used and found it useful. So these are, these are several ways in which AI has been helping us. And apart from that, the companies have also been providing APIs. So in particular, the company OpenAI has been providing us with some APIs that we can use in our applications. So in order to integrate AI into our applications, we can use the APIs provided by companies. Such APIs can be used in SharePoint framework projects as well, and that's what we'll be looking at today. Now, let's have a look at a demo of how we can use OpenAI in SharePoint, and then we can discuss more on that. So what I'll now do is I'll just go to one of the SharePoint sites in my dev tenant, and I have opened a SharePoint page. So this particular SharePoint page is nothing but a news article, and just ignore the top bits at the for now, and then let's have a look at the content. So this is just a simple news article which has some text saying about Microsoft's partnership with OpenAI, and it has got some images and some text content and some other web parts as well. Now, with the help of OpenAI, what we can do is we can ask OpenAI to summarize this content, and then provide us the summary maybe in a line or two. So that's one of the use cases, and that's what I have done here. So if I just scroll all the way to the top, so you can see here that there is a summary section. Now, what this is it's a multilingual summary of this particular SharePoint page. So the content of the page is sent to OpenAI, and OpenAI summarizes that content into multiple languages that we have specified. So in this case, the summary is in English, in French, Spanish, and in Swedish. So we can tell OpenAI to summarize in in different languages based on our requirement. In this case, there are 4 languages, and it has summarized the content, and we are displaying that using an SPFX web part. Now, the other way we are using OpenAI is, this particular section, which is called possible titles. So again, similar to the previous one, what we are doing is we are sending the content to OpenAI and asking it to provide 3 possible titles for this particular article. This title can then be used by the publishers if needed, and they can change the title of this article accordingly. And a final use case that we have here is something called as possible thumbnails, which I am highlighting now. So in this particular case, what we are doing is, again, we are sending the content of the page to OpenAI, asking OpenAI to provide some keywords based on that content. So in this case, I think we are asking for 5 or 6 keywords. And then once we have those keywords, we send those keywords to another API called as Lexica, which then uses those keywords and gives us some images which are being displayed here. And as a publisher of this article, if I like any of these thumbnails, I can use those and set that as the thumbnail of this particular page. Now, in this case, we are using a combination of OpenAI to get the keywords and an API called as Lexica to get the images, but we can use other image providers as well in order to get the images. So these are the 3 web parts. So firstly, the summary web part, which gives us a multilingual summary of the article. Secondly, the possible titles web part, which provides 3 possible titles for this particular article. And finally, the possible thumbnails web part, which provides the thumbnail for this article based on the content. Now, the idea here is we do not want to call the OpenAI API every time a user visits this page. So what we do is once we get the summary or the titles or the keywords, we store them as the metadata of the page so that the OpenAI API is hit only once, and then for the following visits, we just use the page metadata rather than calling the OpenAI API every time. So that's the demo. Now I'll go back to the presentation and then let's talk more about this. Okay. So I have been mentioning about OpenAI, but you might have also heard of Azure OpenAI. Now let's quickly understand the differences between OpenAI and Azure OpenAI, and then see which one we need to use in our applications. So on the left side, we've got OpenAI, and on the right side, we've got the Azure OpenAI. So OpenAI is an independent AI research laboratory. So that was formed in 2015, and there is a lot of information on the history of this OpenAI itself on the web. Whereas Azure OpenAI it's a partnership between OpenAI and Microsoft Azure. Now, OpenAI conducts fundamental research in AI, and they develop advanced AI models. Whereas Azure OpenAI, it provides developers with access to these OpenAI models through Azure. OpenAI is focused on advancing the field of AI as a whole. Azure OpenAI is primarily focused on providing AI solutions to all the businesses through Azure platform. Now, both of these, OpenAI and Azure OpenAI, provide their own API. And we as developers can use either the OpenAI API or the Azure OpenAI API based on our requirement. Now, the decision of using OpenAI API or Azure OpenAI API is not an easy decision. It has to be there has to be certain discussions that need to happen before deciding which API to use. If you are, if you want to test certain things, then definitely you can use OpenAI, OpenAI's API. But the important thing is for production data, it is recommended or it is compulsory to read the data policies that are provided by OpenAI and Azure OpenAI, because we are dealing with production data here, and discuss those policies with the company's legal department before taking a decision on which one to use. However, for Microsoft 365 data, it's good if we use Azure OpenAI, because everything stays within the data boundary provided by Microsoft 365. There are a few links which explain these data policies. I'll be sharing those links towards the end, and the details in those pages have to be read before taking a decision. Now, irrespective of what decision is taken, from a developer's perspective, calling the API, be it OpenAI API or the Azure OpenAI API, calling the API is similar. So in this particular session, we will be looking at OpenAI API. The reason is that it's easy for us to create an account in OpenAI and start accessing the APIs. Whereas for Azure OpenAI, the process is slightly different. We need to fill in a form, and then that has to go through an approval, and then we can get access. But like I said, with respect from a developer's perspective, calling the API is similar, be it OpenAI API or the Azure OpenAI API. Right. Okay. Now, OpenAI API. The company OpenAI, it has developed quite a few AI models, which are being used by different applications, and those models are exposed through an API, and that is nothing but the OpenAI API. It's a tool that provides access to advanced AI models through a simple interface. The API itself, it can easily integrate AI capabilities into our applications. Sorry, give me a minute. Sorry. And the API, it uses deep learning algorithm to provide high quality responses to the queries that are provided by the users. And the API itself can be accessed through a variety of programming languages. So all the hard work of the models is exposed through these APIs, and it has been made easy for us to consume these APIs with a very few lines of code and introduce AI capabilities in our applications. Now, setting up the OpenAI API. This is a very simple process. All we have to do is create an OpenAI account. For this, we just need to go to the OpenAI website and create an account. Once the account is created, we need to obtain an API key. And once we have the API key, we can use the playground, which is again provided by OpenAI, in order to test the capabilities of OpenAI and all the different models. And then we can then decide to use the API into our projects. So let's have a quick look at the OpenAI website itself, how we can create an account, or rather, how we can use the API key and see the playground. So if I just go to my browser, then bring the screen right over here. So the website is platform.openai.com. And what I've done is I've just gone to that website and just create an account. The process is quite straightforward. Just use your personal email address and verify your email, and you will have an account. So at the moment, I am using something called as a personal account, but I think they do also offer a business account, which can be used for for business purpose, right? And then once we have the account, what I've done is I've clicked on the playground link over here, and then this is the playground. And what we can do is they provide certain presets in order to show the capabilities of different models. So say, for example, if I use this particular preset which says correct this to standard English, and when I submit that, it just corrects that properly. So you can try, because this is a playground, you can try various things. And on the right side over here, it gives us all the details as to what model of OpenAI is being used. So in this particular case, it's text DaVinci 3, but we can use other models as well based on the requirement. And if we have to view the code in order to understand how we can use this API, there's a view code button. So when you click on that, it shows us the code in several languages. So based on our requirement, we can, use that particular code and integrate that in our application. So that's the playground itself. So we can use this playground to test various things, and then once we are happy with it, we can then integrate that into our code. Right. Now, with respect to the pricing, there is a page which explains how much is being charged. So everything is based on something called as a token, and you can just do some calculations to understand how much it might cost if we use the OpenAI API in our applications and then take a decision. Right. That's the playground itself. Okay. Now moving on to the next slide, which is integrating OpenAI API with SPFX. Now, earlier I mentioned that there is something called as an API key that is provided by OpenAI when we create an account. That key has to be kept as a secret, and because it is a secret, we should not use it on the client side. Meaning, we cannot directly use that key in our SPFX core. So we have to use it on the server side, and that's why the Azure function comes into picture. So what I mean by that is, if you look at this particular diagram, we've got our SPFX project on the left. In between, we've got the Azure function and then the OpenAI. So from our SPFX project, we call the Azure function. The Azure function then calls the OpenAI using the OpenAI API key. And then OpenAI transforms the data based on our query, sends it back to Azure function. The Azure function then sends it to our SPFX web part. So that's the model we'll be using. Now, just to give a few more details on this particular setup. So in our SPFX project, in this case, a web part, what it does is it gets the data. So we saw that, in the demo, we saw that there was a lot of content on the page. So the SPFX web part gets the content from the page and then passes that content to Azure function. And then once it gets the data back from Azure function, it displays that particular data. The Azure function, what it does is once it receives the request from our SharePoint framework web part, it constructs something called as a prompt with the data that has been provided. So the prompt can be something like, to give you an example, please summarize this particular content in 4 different languages, and then there will be the content. So that's the prompt. There is a field called as prompt engineering if you take a look on the internet, which is in high demand now. So constructing these prompts is gaining more and more importance. So we construct that prompt in Azure function and then use that prompt to call the OpenAI API. So in this case, for example, get the summary of the page. And then once that summary is obtained from OpenAI API, we send it back to the SharePoint framework web part. And the OpenAI itself, it uses the prompt and provides us the high quality response that we desire. Okay, so that's the setup. Now, there are a few use cases of using OpenAI in SharePoint framework. Here are 3 of them, but if you have more, please let us know in the chat, and it would be great to know those. So the 3 that I showed you earlier were summarizing the SharePoint page content in multiple languages, showing possible titles for a page, and showing possible thumbnails for a page. Okay. Now, the next part of this session is the code walkthrough. But before I do that, I'd like to pause here for some time to see if there are any questions that can be answered. Laura, are there any questions?
Yeah, and there's just one question in here. So
Okay.
someone wants to know, is there any disadvantage using Azure Open API? Or excuse me, using Azure Open AI?
No, there's no disadvantage at all. Both OpenAI models and Azure AI models, the Azure OpenAI models are the same ones. So there's no disadvantage of using Azure OpenAI at all. But like I said, the data policies of OpenAI and Azure OpenAI are different. There are different data boundaries. So I will send the links to those, or I have the links to those in the towards the end of the presentation. So please take a look at those and then take a decision. But there's no disadvantage of using Azure OpenAI API.
Brilliant. Thanks, Anoop. And another question just came in there. So someone wants to know, is there any information available about pricing for Azure Open API? Excuse me, AI.
Yes. So I have provided that information. Again, it varies based on the model that is being used. And I guess there are some links provided by Microsoft on docs.microsoft.com. All the pricing will be related to the or will be tied up to an Azure subscription. So it'll come out from your Azure subscription. I'll try to find the link and paste that in the chat towards the end of the webinar.
Great, thanks, Anoop. And 2 more questions just came in there. So someone else is wondering, what are the benefits of Azure Function as middleware?
Right. So, like I said, we have to use or rather, OpenAI provides us the API key, and that key has to be kept as a secret. Now, if we call the OpenAI API directly from the SharePoint Framework projects, then someone can just open the network panel and then get hold of that key, and then they can use that key in any of their other applications, and we will be charged unnecessarily. So basically, your secret is leaked, and you might get a very high bill. So that's why if we introduce Azure functions, that becomes server side, and then the key will be kept as a secret. The other option is, we can use the API management, because all the Azure function does is just call the OpenAI API. So instead of using Azure function, we can use API management as well as a proxy to call the OpenAI. So in that way, you're still calling the OpenAI API from the server, and the key is kept as a secret. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Anoop. And then the last question here is, from where will we get OpenAI key? Can you show it to us, please?
Yeah, sure. Let me just switch to my browser again. And here I have logged into the OpenAI website with my account. And then when I click on my account name on the right side, and then there's a link here, view API keys. When I click on that, it shows you the API keys. So you can create as many as you want. Right.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Anoop. That is all the questions that we have there. So you can carry on now with your presentation.
All right, brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, so now let's walk through the code of an SPFX web part, which uses, which calls an Azure function, which then calls OpenAI API to get the data. So what I've done is I've taken a screenshot of the code, and then this code will be shared towards the end of this presentation. So all the code is present on GitHub. It has got a README file as well, which explains how to use this particular code. I have added the code for the summarize page content web part and the thumbnails web part as well. I haven't added the code for possible titles, but we can just modify the summarize web part to get that as well. Right. So just to explain this particular screenshot, on the left side you see the code tree itself or the code structure itself. So what I've done is I've expanded the summarize web part and highlighted the summarize component, which is the main component. And I won't be showing all the functions in the code. I'll be showing the important functions in the code only. So for the summarize web part, just to show you the web part once again. So it's this particular web part, which summarizes the content of the page in multiple languages and displays that on the SharePoint page itself. So there is a component called as summarize.tsx, and this particular component has got a method called as get page content using Graph API. So this is the first step that needs to be done. So we have to get the page content so that we can pass that content onto OpenAI API for it to summarize. In order to get the page content, we can use the Microsoft Graph Pages API, which is still in beta, but I'm sure it'll be GA soon. So we use that Microsoft Graph API, Pages API, and what we do here is go through all the web parts of the page and get only the text web part on the pages. And then once we have those web parts, we extract the inner HTML from those web parts with which we just get the text content. And then we combine all of that into a variable. So that's what this particular method does, getting the page content using Graph API. Once we have the component, once we have the content, what we do is we have to call an Azure function, which then calls OpenAI. So there's a function called as get summary using OpenAI, which accepts page content as a parameter. And now I've created a couple of hooks in order to call Azure function. Now it's not mandatory to use React hooks, but I just wanted to show one of the ways in which we can call Azure function. So there's a React hook called as use Azure function. What that does is, firstly, it gets the AAD HTTP client with the method called as get client. And then once we have that, we just compose the body of the request. If it is get, it's a query string. If it is post, then we need to JSON.stringify the request. In this case, it is a post request. And then what we do is we just call the Azure function itself and await for the response. And once we get the response, we just send the response back to the component. So this is just a simple Azure function call. You might have done that in several of your applications, not in this way, but in other ways. So basically, we are calling an Azure function here and passing some data to it. That's all there is to it. Now let's look at the Azure function itself. So in that same particular folder, in that same particular summarize folder, I have a folder called Azure functions. And there are two Azure functions in that. One is summarize and the other one is update page. So summarize basically uses the content of the page and then calls OpenAI, gets the summary, and the update page just updates the page metadata. So let's have a look at the summarize function first. So what we do here is we get the content that is passed to the Azure function, and then we have to create the prompt. that needs to be passed to OpenAI. So in order to create that prompt, what I've done here is just using a JSON file called as data.json, and we will be replacing the curly braces content in that with the content that is passed. So let's have a look at the JSON file itself. So here's the data.json. Now this is the data that needs to be passed to OpenAI. So just to quickly explain to you what this is pretty standard. So this particular JSON, the way I've got that is, if I just go back to the playground again, and then load a preset, say for example that one, summarize, and then view code, and click on JSON. So you can see that here there is some JSON, although it uses a different model. It has got prompt and some other parameters as well. So now if I just go back to the presentation, I've created a similar JSON, but with a different model. It's called as GPT 3.5 Turbo. It's not necessary that you have to use this. You can use other models as well, but I just have used this model for this use case. And then here I have created a content which says, give me one short sentence summary in English, French, Spanish, and Swedish for this particular content. You can see that curly brace content over here. And this will be the data that will be passed to OpenAI API. There are some other parameters like temperature, maximum tokens, etc. These parameters have different meanings. All that is provided in the OpenAI documentation. You can have a look at those and adjust these as per our requirement. So I've just set it as default for this demo. Okay, so the main thing here is this particular message, which says one short sentence summary in English, French, Spanish, and Swedish of that particular content in curly braces. So that content in curly braces will be replaced by the content that we pass to the Azure function, and that's what this particular code does. And then what we do is we get two variables. One is the API endpoint, and the other one is the API key. We store those in the app settings. So I've just shown the local settings file here. So you can see that I've got the API endpoint, and I've got the secret over here, which of course is a dummy secret. So we just get those from the app settings, and then we need to use them in order to call the OpenAI API itself. And then all we do here is we just use the invoke web request. Now, this particular Azure function is a PowerShell-based Azure function. So that's why we are calling the invoke web request PowerShell commandlet. But it is not compulsory that you have to use PowerShell. You can use any language that Azure Functions supports and call the OpenAI API. I'm using PowerShell because I just wanted to use PNP PowerShell in the next function that I'll be showing in a minute. But yeah, coming back to this, what we do is we use the invoke web request commandlet in order to call the OpenAI API endpoint and pass the headers and the body that we created earlier. And then once we get the response, we check if everything is okay with the response. If everything is okay, then we just extract the content from that response. So that particular response return has a particular format, which again is available in the documentation. We just have to look for something called as a choices property and then select the first object from that. And then we just, once we have the text, we return that. So in this case, what happens is the text which we have asked OpenAI for, which is one short sentence summary in 4 different languages, that particular text is returned. And then we extract that text and then pass it back to SharePoint. Okay, and then we don't want to call the OpenAI API every time someone visits a page because once the page has been summarized, we don't want it to summarize again and again. So what we do for that reason is we just store the summary of the page as a metadata of the page itself. In order to do that, we just have this function called as update page. This particular function uses PNP PowerShell in order to update the page. So here we're just connecting to the site using client ID and client secret. Now, if you just look at the line above, you can use managed identity as well instead of using client ID and client secret. But while debugging locally, we need a client ID and client secret because managed identity will not be available locally. And then once we connect to the site, this is just standard PNP PowerShell code. We get that particular page and then use the set PNP list item commandlet in order to set the value of the summary column with the data that we have, and then we just publish the page. So that's the code. Now, before I jump into the summary, I'll pause here again for to answer any questions based on the code.
Thanks for that, Anoop. There doesn't seem to be any new questions in here, so
Okay.
maybe we can continue on and pause again in another while if there's some questions.
All right, thanks. Okay, so that was the code walkthrough. Now, just to summarize the usage of OpenAI API and this session. So OpenAI provides us APIs, and those APIs can be used in SharePoint Framework projects, and that's what we saw in this particular session. And like I mentioned earlier, Azure OpenAI provides APIs too, and we can use those APIs as well. Now for production data, I'll just stress upon this once again. Please read the data policies, understand the data policies, speak to your security department if needed, and then proceed with using the right API that is suitable. We saw some scenarios that in which OpenAI API can be used in SharePoint projects. But if there are any other scenarios that you think of, please let me know. I'll be happy to hear those. Now, here are some resources that are part of this session. So, firstly, the OpenAI data policy, which I think I've got that open. Yeah, just bring that over here. So this page details the data policies associated with the OpenAI API. Can go through that. Similarly, Azure OpenAI also has its data policies, and there's a link for that as well. And the code that I showed in this session, there's a link to that as well. I haven't made that repository public yet. I will do that as soon as this webinar ends. And that's it from my side. Happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Brilliant. Thanks, Anoop, for a great presentation and a great demo. So I'll just have a look here now at the questions. So I see there is one or two questions here. So someone wants to know, how does OpenAI API improve the accuracy of translations in SharePoint?
Right. So the translations again, it's mostly trial and error. So if you are happy with the translations provided by OpenAI API, then you can use those. So what you can do is you can use the playground in order to see the different translation results, and use that in order to see if the translations are helpful to you, and if they are not helpful, then like I said earlier, what we can do is we can create our own translations and store them against the page metadata. But in that case, you won't be using OpenAI. However, if you want to test the translations, please use the playground and try and use the different models in the playground and see which suits best. But yeah, I am not 100% sure as to what model is being used in the background by OpenAI in order to provide us the translations. There will be some complex logic, I'm sure, which I'm not aware of.
Brilliant. Thanks, Anoop, for answering that question.
No,
So another person is asking, how can developers implement this solution in their SharePoint framework projects?
yeah. So I'll be sharing the code of the web part very soon. I've got the link for that. So in the SharePoint framework web parts, we have to call this Azure function, like I showed earlier. The Azure function then calls the OpenAI API, and yeah, we can display the API. So the SharePoint framework web part, the SharePoint framework project can either be a web part, which I showed earlier, or it can be an application customizer as well, based on the requirement. Yeah, but calling the API, OpenAI API directly from SharePoint framework web parts or SharePoint framework projects is not advisable. Even OpenAI have the same information in their documentation saying that the secret should not be exposed on the client side. So that's why there has to be a middleware or a server that has to come into picture, be it an Azure function or an app service like an API.
Brilliant. And there's just one question then. So someone wants to know, can this approach be used to translate multimedia content in SharePoint, such as videos and images?
That's a good question. I personally haven't tried that myself, but there must be some options available, because all I have done is played only with the text model that the OpenAI provides. I haven't used the other APIs. I know that there is a text to image API, which is the DALI API. So we provide some text and it gives us back the image. However, I haven't seen or worked with image analyzer or video analyzer APIs. So sorry, I cannot answer that question.
That's brilliant, Anoop. Thank you so much for answering all those questions. So that wraps up our questions and answers session. So I just want to say a big thank you on behalf of the ESPC community to yourself, Anoop, for taking the time today to carry out this webinar. We really, really appreciate it.
Oh, nice. Thank you very much.
So that is the end of today's webinar. You can find this webinar and more at sharepointeurope.com/resource center. That is it for today, folks. Thank you again to everyone for joining us today. Take care, and we hope that you'll join us again for more learning. Bye for now.